Hello, welcome to Upon This Rock, your midweek online Bible study from Solid Rock Drogheda. We're looking at Mark's Gospel. We're going through it verse by verse, but before we do that, Janice is going to lead us in a worship song, an old hymn. So I invite you to worship along with her now.
Stand up for Jesus, ye soldiers of the cross. Lift high his royal banner, it must not suffer loss. From victory unto victory, his army he shall lead, till every foe is vanquished, and Christ is Lord indeed. Stand up for Jesus, the trumpet call obey. Forth to the mighty conflict, in this his glorious day. Ye that are men now serve him against unnumbered foes. Let courage rise with danger, and strength to strength oppose. Stand up for Jesus, stand in his strength alone. The arm of flesh will fail you, ye dare not trust your own. Put on salvation armor, and watching unto prayer, where duty calls or danger, be never wanting there. Stand up for Jesus, the strife will not be long. This day the noise of battle, the next the victor's song. To him that overcometh, a crown of life shall be. He with the King of glory shall reign eternally.
Thank you, Janice. So we're in Mark chapter 10, and this is episode 25 of our studies in Mark's Gospel. And we'd got up to verse 31 last time around. So we're now starting reading it again at verse 32. So we've just finished where the passage about the rich young ruler. Verse 32. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. Now, the Bible talks about going up to Jerusalem, and if you ever have the opportunity to visit Jerusalem, you'll most likely fly into Tel Aviv airport. That's the usual way. I've come in another way, crossing over by land from Jordan. But wherever way you come into Israel, you have to go up to get to Jerusalem. It really is up high. You keep going up hills. And it was a pilgrimage that people would go to Jerusalem for the major festivals. They would say, let us go up to the house of the Lord. But there's also, as they're making their way up to Jerusalem, there's also some little, if you like, reminders of, Jesus saying, if I be lifted up, will draw all men unto me. Because this journey to Jerusalem is his last journey to Jerusalem. It's building up to this final Passover and his crucifixion and everything else. And also, of course, a real parallel with this as well is Isaac. Whenever Isaac was offered up as a sacrifice by Abraham, and God provided a substitute at the last minute, of course, that took place, we believe, on the same mountain where the temple would later be built, Mount Zion. But also Isaac went up the mountain with Abraham, and now Jesus is going on his way up to Jerusalem, if you like, retreading those footsteps to be the perfect fulfillment of what Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac had always foretold, which was an innocent substitute taking our place and dying in our stead. Anyway, so they're heading up to Jerusalem, and we're told that there was astonishment among the disciples and fear among those that were following. And there's probably two reasons for this. One was they knew that the situation now had become very antagonistic towards Jesus, that there was physical danger involved in going up to Jerusalem. And also it's quite likely that there was something in Jesus' own attitude, that he had set his face to go to Jerusalem and embrace the destiny that he knew was God's plan for him. And so there's astonishment and fear among those that are following him there. And Jesus says in verse 33, we are going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise. Now, in the last two chapters, in chapter 8 and chapter 9, Jesus has already made a couple of predictions about his future and what's going to happen in Jerusalem. He'd already predicted that he would be handed over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. He'd already predicted that he would be condemned. In both the predictions, he had said that he was going to die and that he was going to be raised from the dead again. And these, all elements of it are all repeated here, at being handed over to the chief priests, being condemned, being killed, being raised from the dead. But there's, if you like, there's four extra elements of what was going to happen to him that haven't been revealed before. And this is very much how God does things. You know, God doesn't always just show things, everything in one go, but there's a principle that happens in the scripture and in the spiritual life called progressive revelation, where we see part of the plan of God and then a bit more and then a bit more and then a bit more. And you see it through the Old Testament with who Jesus, the Messiah, was going to come, and what, you know, right from Genesis, it just adds up a little bit more right through the Old Testament until you have this big picture of who the Messiah is going to be, and then Jesus comes as a fulfillment of it. And in the same way, this is the third major prediction in 3 chapters in Mark's Gospel, but this one now has more elements. It says that not only will he be handed over to the chief priests and religious teachers, he's also going to be handed over to the Gentiles, to the Romans. Also, he's going to be mocked. Also, they're going to spit upon him, and also that he is going to be flogged. So we can see the revelation progressively building up. Verse 35. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. Now, this seems a singularly inappropriate request to be bringing when Jesus has just been telling them how he's going to suffer and be killed. It seems like they don't care about Jesus. Now, I'd like to be charitable here and say, well, how long is the gap between these two events? Between Jesus saying about him going to be killed and how he's going to be killed, and then James and John coming to him. And I'd like to think, well, maybe there's a big gap between them, but I'm probably wrong in that, because in Matthew chapter 20, the same account is there, and it's the exact same order that, again, Jesus predicts his death, and it says then James and John came with their mother. Matthew happens to mention that it was their mother came as well, arguing on their behalf. And so this is inappropriate, given that Jesus has been talking about his suffering. It's like all they're thinking about is themselves. Verse 38. You don't know what you are asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? Speaking about suffering. We can, they answered. And Jesus said to them, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. So Jesus is still talking about suffering here. He's saying that he is going to suffer, and as his disciples, there's going to be suffering then. They're going to have to suffer as well. Instead of thinking about who's going to be the most important, they should be thinking about that. Are they prepared to suffer with him? And then he also says, but to sit at my right hand or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. The problem is they are still taking earthly kingdom models and trying to apply them to the heavenly kingdom. They're saying an earthly ruler has a right-hand man and a left-hand man that share in his glory and his power and maybe even take his position after he dies. And they're taking that earthly model of the earthly empires and kingdoms and trying to apply it to Jesus. And Jesus saying, hang on, this is the heavenly kingdom. This is different. It's not, I'm not handing out positions like that. There's no favors for you. There's no power, privileges, and perks of the job. This is not what this is about. Verse 41, when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Not that they were any different. They weren't indignant because James and John were thinking of themselves rather than the suffering of Jesus. I mean, the rest of the disciples were thinking of themselves too. They were just annoyed that James and John got in first before they did. Verse 42, Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. So Jesus is getting back to why is this request so wrong? Because it's earthly thinking about a heavenly kingdom. You know, one of the biggest failings we have in the church is we tend to copy the earthly models of leadership that we see around us and apply them in the church. We see this from very early on in the church that began as this wonderful grassroots with servant apostles and pastors and prophets and teachers. Instead, it copied the Roman Empire, where you had rulers, princes of the church who would wear fancy hats and scarlet cloaks and fine robes. And they took the earthly model of leadership that they saw in the imperial system and copied it in the church by creating bishops and archbishops and cardinals and popes and everything else. And basically it went in line, it continued along with a political system of leadership of kings and princes, and bishops even became known as the princes of the church, aping and copying the world's model of leadership. And you see this in culture after culture. For example, in Africa. You know, I've traveled Africa many times, so wonderful times with the believers there. I've had such great joys in Africa and admire many of the African leaders so much. But what I have seen is this, that the political model of leadership in Africa, of the big strong man leader who everyone's a bit afraid of but sort of respects, you get that in the church as well. You get pastors acting like dictators, copying what they see the presidents of their country doing. In the US, you have basically, it's been exalting the businessman, the successful. US doesn't have kings and queens, but they worship success. And so they want presidents that look like successful businessmen. And we see that in the church. We see that the churches are looking for a successful leader that will bring in the crowds and win people over from the competitors. And that becomes the dominant model of leadership. And that we've seen that in Western Europe as well. In Eastern Europe, people who grew up under the communist system, often I've seen develop in churches of people from Eastern Europe. I've often seen a lot of politics, a lot of church politics being played out behind the scenes, copying what they grew up with in the surroundings around them. And of course, today, one of the most, we live in an age where the celebrity is worshipped. And now it seems like pastors, the most successful pastors are those who are the most successful entertainers and celebrities. And again, this is not what Jesus called us to be. These are the world's standards of leadership. And he says, verse 43, not so with you. He doesn't want the church to have leaders who are princes, who are celebrities, who are successful business managers over the church, are big, tough men of God like the presidency, who are good at playing politics. Jesus said, no, that's not what it's about. Not so with you, verse 43. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Servant leadership is the only authentic model of Christian leadership. And I remember years ago, I visited another country and I was teaching on servant leadership. We had some very interesting seminars, people really getting into it, really catching it. And, it was in a culture where servant leadership isn't generally valued. And as we were looking at what the Bible said and what Jesus taught, I could see people really catching it on. I thought, this is great. And I remember when we got to the end, one of the instructors there, this guy was basically a professor, linked with the whole degree program that I was training people in. And he basically said, well, we thank our brother from Ireland, and that's an interesting model of leadership. It's one of many models of leadership. And I thought, man, this guy's missed it totally. And he's actually just undone all the work I came here to do. Because servant leadership is not one among many models of Christian leadership. Servant leadership is the model of Christian leadership, the model of Jesus. Jesus didn't say, hey, this is one of a different range of different options you can choose from. He said, but whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. There's no other way. It's like saying you must be born again. There's no other way. No other way to be saved but by being born again, because you must be born again. And there's no way to be an effective, godly Christian leader without being a servant. You must become a servant. Verse 46. Then they came to Jericho. Just before we there's just this little section here before we get to the end of Mark chapter 10. And it's where the blind man Bartimaeus is going to be healed. It says, they came to Jericho, verse 46, as Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city. A blind man Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, Bartimaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Now, we know that he wasn't alone, because Matthew tells us in his account of the same miracle that there were two men there. So why does Mark only mention one of them? It's not a contradiction, by the way. If Matthew says there were two men and Mark only happens to mention one of them, that's not a contradiction. Mark just left out about the other guy. Why? Well, possibly because Bartimaeus was somebody whose Mark's audience that he was writing to, they'd heard of Bartimaeus, so that's why they'd identify with him. Or maybe it's because Bartimaeus was the one who took the initiative in crying out to Jesus. Anyway, verse 48, many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him. So they called to the blind man, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. And throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. You know, when you shout out to Jesus for help, other people hear your cry and they try to discourage you. You know, shut up, leave him be. They rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he just shouted all the more. When other people rebuke you for crying out to Jesus for help, the temptation is because you're being rebuked, to be silent. No, shout out louder, because Jesus hears your cry and Jesus sends you your miracle. And that's what happens here. And it says when Jesus said, come, call him. And they said, oh, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. It says he threw his cloak aside. Two possible reasons for that. One would be the cloak would have hindered him. He wanted to run to Jesus as fast as possible, so the cloak was in the way, so he just threw the cloak off. The other suggestion that many Bible teachers have said is that it was a special cloak, that the cloak that he wore was one that identified him as a beggar, so that people would give him money. And again, if he's thrown that cloak aside, he's confident that he's not going to need it anymore because he's got faith that he's about to be healed. Verse 51, what do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked him. And the blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Go, said Jesus, your faith has healed you. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. This is such an obvious question. What do you want me to do for you? Sometimes we assume we know what people need. But Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? Even though he's a blind man, you think it's pretty obvious. But Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? And we can certainly copy that to say to people, what is it you want Jesus to do for you before we start witnessing to them and praying to them? Anyway, he says, I want to see. Jesus says, your faith has healed you. And it says immediately he healed his sight. Jesus speaks the word and it is done. And I want to close tonight's study by saying, if you're asking Jesus to do something in your life, cry out to him. And as Jesus speaks the word, it is done in Jesus' name. Thanks for joining us tonight. We will continue next Wednesday, 7:30 p.m. here in my office, and we'll start getting into Mark chapter 11. So do join us then. But until then, God bless you.